One of our primary projects at State Support is maintaining Minnesota's statewide legal information website, lawhelpmn.org, which is really going to frame a lot of what we're talking about today.
And I'm Emily Good, and I'm also at Legal Services State Support in Minnesota. I'm the pro bono project manager, but my suite of responsibilities also includes Law Help MN, Pro Justice MN, our online legal advice website, trainings, many things. And I did a lot of work too when we did the Law Help MN rebuild. So that's kind of our background. And Jay is a cat owner. I volunteer doing wildlife rehab. Those are our fun facts for the day, and they may be mildly relevant to our slides.
You're a cat owner?
She is the cat.
I have 3 beautiful cats.
When you say you're owned?
That is probably more accurate.
All right, so kind of why we're here today. Starting point, our Law Help MN website has a chat function, and we find that our chat function on Law Help MN, even though some days we don't love signing into chat, is a really great kind of wealth of resources and information about users, and gives us really good connections with how people are looking for stuff, what they're asking for, what they're expecting to find. And so I was on chat one day and had what could best be described as a curious chat. I actually pulled up this excerpt from the chat. Not that uncommon. I have a child, I'm not married, I'm wondering about my rights. Can, my mom claim legal rights to stop the father from taking the child? So I was like, okay, this seems pretty straightforward. Let me see what I can find for you. But, first, has the father, has he established paternity rights yet? Because even though we aren't giving legal advice through this, that's still just a question that I want to know fundamentally, so that I'm getting this person the right, trying to collect the right resources for them. So I asked them that question, and the answer that came back was, he's speaking to a solicitor. And I said, solicitors aren't super common in Minnesota. And so then the next thing I did was just take a quick glance over at kind of the chat details we have about where somebody is chatting from. And it said Cardiff in the United Kingdom. And at this point I was like, it seems like you're in Wales. Is that right? Because of course people can be masking their location might be pinging weird, so I don't ever assume that the location data that I'm getting is accurate. Or also, we've definitely had people where they're located in Florida, but they're chatting in Minnesota because they live in Minnesota half of the year that it's not freezing cold. And so I looked over there, though, and I went, yeah, you're not from here, and your question tells me that you're not here. And so I said, we don't really have anything for you. And in that case, honestly, I was sort of at a loss. Normally, I would go find whatever other state has a Law Help or a similar site, but for the UK, to be quite honest, I wasn't even sure where to send them. And they dropped off as soon as I said, I'm in Minnesota, you're in the United Kingdom, I don't think I'm gonna be useful. But the other thing I checked on that chat too is down at the bottom in the chat info, we can see how they came into our website. And the address information that was down there told me that they had come from they'd done some sort of Google search and had landed on a resource we have called The Rights and Responsibilities of Unmarried Parents. And that is this great booklet we have that we've been publishing for a long time at State Support. And so I have this person from Wales, they found this resource in Minnesota. Jay's office was directly across the hall from me. And as is pretty common, I saunter across the hall and say, hey, so I just had a chat from Wales. They came in through the Rights and Responsibilities booklet, which wasn't a huge surprise to us because we know from our Google Analytics and from looking at our traffic that resource at the time was Google searches based on that resources were driving about 12% of the total traffic to Law Help MN, which is a really high percentage. And so as I'm saying this to Jay about my chatter from Wales, Jay says, oh yeah, I talked to somebody from the Philippines just a week or two ago, similarly, which then made us go, how many of our visitors are arriving not even not from Minnesota, but like, is this, like, you had a chat from the Philippines, I had a chat from Wales. Chats really, we don't get a ton of chats, like maybe 400 or so every 6 months. So if we're getting these chatters from other countries, what does the rest of our geographic traffic look like? And so that's kind of where our discovery process started, and that's kind of then what laid the foundation for why we're all here today.
Yeah. So Emily comes into my office. I say, yep, I had a chatter from Philippines with the same question last week. So then we huddled around my computer and pulled up Google Analytics to look at, like, where are the people coming from who are looking specifically at the unmarried parents guide. Because clearly we have in 2 weeks somebody who's like actively engaging with us from England and from Wales and from the Philippines. So we went in and looked at Google Analytics geographic information for that particular resource, found that I think right now Minnesota is still the top region, but it makes up, I think, like maybe less than 10% of the traffic for that resource is from Minnesota. The rest of the traffic is coming from New York, California, Illinois, the most populous states, I think, is really driving the traffic, and then a ton of traffic from English-speaking countries outside of the US. And then Emily and I were like, we should do a presentation at ITC about this and see what other folks are finding on their traffic. So before we get into that, I wanted to do a quick walkthrough about how do you actually find this information using Google Analytics, so that if you are one of the folks in your office responsible for looking at traffic on your website, you have the tools to take a look at where your folks are coming from as well. So before I do that, how many of you in this room are working with a website that your organization runs in some way or another? Awesome. That's almost everybody for those of you joining us online, if there's anybody out there. So that's great, and I hope that we can have a really good discussion at the second part of our presentation around how we as a community of folks maintaining legal information websites can make sure we're helping each other get users to the right place and to the best resource for their legal needs. Quick Google Analytics walkthrough of a few things that we found helpful in terms of figuring out who your website visitors are. So this is, I'm going to play this video, and this is how you can find where your visitors are coming from for a particular resource. So if you go to your Google Analytics for your website and click on the Behavior tab, and then go to the site content and find the particular page that you're looking for. In this case, it was really easy for us. We went to our Rights and Responsibilities of Unmarried Parents, which is our most popular resource. And then under the Primary Dimensions tab there at the top, if you can see that, there's a link that says Other. And if you click on that link, you can look at a secondary dimension to measure your traffic, and that's where you can find geographic location information for a particular resource. That is nested under the Users tab there. And, oh boy. And if you click on Users, then there's a few different geographic breakdowns that you can choose. I chose region, which will give you by state, and then country, and sometimes metro areas. So you can see here that Minnesota is the top. This is about a week's worth of traffic, followed by New York, followed by England. So we're clearly getting tons of traffic from outside of Minnesota.
I also love that number 7 is Metro Manila.
Right, which tells you how popular the Philippines are for some reason. I don't know why. I have had multiple chatters from the Philippines.
Yeah.
That's one tool that you can use to figure out where people are coming from. And so we went ahead and did this this breakdown for, I think, our top 10 resources to figure out, is this isolated to the Unmarried Parents Guide, or is it across the website? You can also look at where your users are from for your entire website through a similar process. For this one, within Google Analytics, if you go to the Audience tab, and then there will be a section under that called Geo, then you can look at location, and the default for that is by country. So you can see for your entire website, for all of the traffic coming to your website, what country are folks coming from. So luckily, most of our people are in the United States at least, but we still have, a fairly significant amount coming from other English-speaking countries, which I think is just something to be really cognizant of as you're like developing content and thinking about who are the people who are actually finding you. So as we were kind of delving into our Google Analytics data, we were also thinking about how are people getting to the website. We had just undergone a website redesign where I think our implicit assumption was that people start at the home page. So we went into Google Analytics and looked at are people landing when they first get to our page on our home page, which you can see that beautiful mock-up, or are they landing on the rights and responsibilities of unmarried parents? And we found that a lot of people are not coming to the home page first. Most people are coming to rights and responsibilities of unmarried parents, which is another important thing to think about that we need to do more thinking about in terms of how you design your website. And if you're trying to get people to a certain part of your site or make sure that they know that the site is for Minnesota legal problems, what do you need to do on your content pages, not just your home page? Because a lot of people are going to end up starting on your content pages and maybe never even see your home page.
And we think that, Law Help MN, we've got this cute little outline of the state of Minnesota. It's in our logo. Clearly, just like Minnesota, we're so above average. Everybody knows what the state of Minnesota looks like, or they probably don't if they're from Philippines or Wales or anywhere else also. And so that was kind of a conclusion, like we have this, what we think is pretty Minnesota-centric branding, but people probably aren't seeing that or
tagline
really
is
comprehending it.
Yeah, and our tagline is helping Minnesotans solve legal problems. Another thing we realize is that, and I realize this talking to my non-lawyer friends, is that people don't realize that laws, especially things like family and housing laws, are so state-specific and jurisdiction-specific. So somebody could notice that this is Minnesota and not think that it matters. So they could be like, well, great, it's about my rights as an unmarried parent. Doesn't matter where I live. So anyway, to figure out your landing page, and if you all have access to your Google Analytics, I welcome you to kind of follow along and see what your data looks like for your websites, because I think that could really inform our conversation later on. But if you're in Google Analytics, going to behavior and then to site content, there's an option there to select landing page. And then that'll show you what percentage of folks are coming into certain pages on your website, so where they're basically starting out on your site. So another dimension that we looked at during our huddle around my desk after our chatter from Wales was, so we have all these people coming in from outside of Minnesota. Are they staying on our website? Or are they saying, oh, this is Minnesota, this isn't for me, and then bouncing? And that's a case where we would be actually fine with seeing a high bounce rate on a particular page if folks really shouldn't be there in terms of finding out their legal rights. So we looked at that and found that for the rights and responsibilities of unmarried parents, you can see all the way to the right, folks are spending an average of 7 minutes on that resource. So we inferred from that people are actually taking the time to read through this resource, even if it might have information that's not applicable for their particular situation. So that was another thing that kind of raised our concern level to make sure that we weren't providing inaccurate information to visitors, because we care about non-Minnesotans too. Even though our mission is to support Minnesotans, we obviously care about all of our website users, and really felt like we needed to broaden our horizon in terms of who we were thinking about as the folks who we were serving. So this led to a few other questions.
Yeah, and one of them was like, how much of a, not problem, but how much of a problem is this? So we have, obviously, a lot of our resources are going to be state-specific law, family law, housing law. Those are things that are going to be very different, potentially, for Minnesota versus other states. Then we also have immigration resources. One of the other resources that shows up pretty high in terms of our out-of-state traffic is a fact sheet we have called Proving Your Child's Citizenship. And that's purely focused on immigration law, which is federal. And so that one, we decided, okay, that we're not really going to worry about, because if somebody from California and somebody from Florida or Texas is reading that information is going to be basically the same for them. If we had something on getting a driver's license in Minnesota under our immigration, that's going to be very different. But presumably they would figure that one out when they read about going to DPS. So that was one other thing that we kind of looked at, and that we would encourage people to, is like, is this a resource that is very state specific and state intensive, or is this a resource where it's probably okay if people are getting to it, and that maybe part of it, for instance, if you are running like an immigration-based site or maybe Social Security or some other federal practice area, less of a problem. And so then we went to, what can we do right now to help adjust the fact that people are arriving here from other places, and how do we sort of do a better job of cluing them in to the fact that this is Minnesota, and also that laws are different in different states. And so our immediate fix was to basically just add a line of text at the top of the Rights and Responsibilities of Unmarried Parents guide that says, laws vary from state to state. I think we just said state to state. We did not say country to country, but sort of hoping that would come through. And then made a note that, this booklet applies to Minnesota law. The laws in your state could be different. And so that's now the very top line of text. And we are both happy and sad to report that, at least based on our most recent Google searches, we used to be the top excerpted text on a Google search for unmarried parents was from our booklet. We are happy to report, I think, that we no longer are, and that we're now like the 5th result down on the first page of the Google results, which we actually feel a tiny bit sad about, but on balance we're kind of happy about, because again, we are clearly drawing a lot of traffic. And that change didn't happen super fast. Like, we added that text and then for months continued to see exactly the same traffic numbers. So who knows, but that was sort of our immediate change. And then we kind of were thinking about what else can we or should we do? And so that's still where we're at, is what else do we need to do to educate or to communicate? And then again, like, how do we do a better job potentially of redirecting people to resources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and part of that thinking was looking at, like, how are people finding us? So, like Emily said, we were that little featured result in Google for a really long time. So we wanted to drill down in Google Analytics also about like, what are the mechanisms through which people are finding us? What are the search terms they're using? Are they being referred from other pages? And I thought that my cat Mickey could help us with that. So in order to find that information, if you go to acquisition, and then we just looked at for all traffic. If you look at channels, then you'll see a very rough breakdown of are people finding you through organic search, which would be like if somebody was just Googling or using DuckDuckGo. You can look by search engine as well. Do they know your URL and they're typing that into the browser? That would be direct. And then referral would be if they're coming from a different website, which is also another really great analytic to drill down into. So if you just click on that referral link, then you can see which websites are referring folks to your website, which for us, that's primarily our Minnesota courts send a lot of folks to our website. And that can be a great one to look at as you're developing partnerships with other programs. So you can see here, when you click on referral, then it'll show you where people are coming from. So we're getting people from our partner legal aid organizations, from the National Law Help site, and then from the courts as well, as a few other resources. I think most people, if you've used Google Analytics, probably already know this one as well, but we also wanted to just look at what devices are people using. This is always like a good check, especially as you're looking at your designs, to see are people using desktop versus mobile. And I think that's been talked a lot about at ITC conferences. But we're seeing about 65% mobile, which is always good to just keep in mind.
So our realization was sort of that there's potentially two explanations for why we're getting all of this other traffic. One of them is that people are digging for nuts they buried and they have no idea where they buried them. And so they are not finding potentially the resource that does exist in their state, or the appropriate resource that does exist for them for whatever reason is not coming up. So So that's one thing that's happening. And then the other one is that potentially it's just an unmet need. I don't know if anybody has ever seen, there's this great BBC program called Walk on the Wild Side, and there's this marmot who's like, Ellen, 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 Ellen. Oh gosh, it's Steve, 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 Steve. So that's the Alan marmot. But I think of that's the unmet need, right? Like, he's like calling the wrong name out. And so these people are out there like calling for Alan, and you're Steve, and maybe you just don't have an Alan. And so we were sort of thinking, these are two different, we treat these two problems differently. So if it is an unfound need, how can we redirect people to that? And so how do we share and cooperate with all of the other programs in order to say, how do we get these people to you? Or if they're not, if it's something that you don't have, can we give you our rights and responsibilities of Unmarried Parents Guide and you adapt it? Like, is that helpful? And so then that's kind of what we want to spend time talking about. And I will just take this moment. We are being recorded, which is why I now picked this up. And so I will walk around with the mic so that for anybody who is watching or for the future recording, so that we can make sure that they can hear you, even though you're probably loud enough for us to hear you, they may not be. So I will go ahead and rove and
Great.
Yeah.
So
So
go ahead.
this is the, well, now found need, if you will. So we thought we'd start by talking about unfound needs. And if people have any, we can also just like chatter. But, and actually I should just say any questions that people have or comments at this point.
I know one of the things, or one of my comments is that we're from Arizona. And so one thing we found is when you state abbreviations, other countries don't know that. So MN may be considered Manchester from the UK. AZ, a lot of foreigners read it as A2Z. And so that's one of our issues. And so we have to make sure we use Arizona throughout all of our language and in all of our meta tags. And then also, do you guys have any bilingual information? Because all of our Spanish content gets huge hits from Latin America, which is not a bad thing, but once again, we don't know if it's relevant. Our third most popular page is actually one of our Spanish language pages, and on average, it gets about probably 2,000 hits a month from other countries.
Yeah, I guess I haven't drilled down specifically. We have content in Spanish, Hmong, and Somali are our primary languages in Minnesota. And none of them get a ton of traffic. But I haven't looked specifically actually at the geographic information for that. So that is something we will definitely do though.
Yeah, in our booklet, the rights and responsibilities of unmarried parents is not in Spanish. It's not in other languages just because it's so huge. It's not something that's ever been translated. I think it runs to like 90 pages. And we have 160 fact sheets, and almost all of those are translated. So there's kind of but that's a really interesting point about state abbreviations.
Do you think that if you tacked on to the title of that booklet in Minnesota, it would make a meaningful difference? Have you tried that?
Yeah, we've talked about that. And one of the things that we've talked about too is that a lot of our resources were first developed for print, like back in the day before we had Law Help, and are still used in print by our legal aid partners when they're like out in the community or if they live in rural areas. They just keep a stack of the booklets or the fact sheets. And we've talked about like maybe we need to really think harder about how we design that content differently for the website, and like do things like for things that are state specific, add that to the title. Whereas like as things have just like kind of developed over the years, because it was on paper, we never had to think about somebody wouldn't know that this was for Minnesota because we were handing it to them and they were in Minnesota. So that's a really good point. Thank you.
So as you were talking, it's not a quick, easy fix, but of course I'm reluctant to put information on a web page that people don't have to have. So if you're having Minnesota visitors, you don't want to say in Minnesota because it's 2 more words, and Minnesota is a big word for people, even if they, if they struggle to reading. But you're on a Law Help website, right? I mean, it's the Pro Bono Net Law Help.
We are on our own platform.
Oh, you're on your own platform. So, I mean, as you're saying this is definitely true for us in Massachusetts, that we have a fraction of our visitors are from Massachusetts. But wouldn't it be cool if, and you don't want to dissuade people because maybe somebody's on vacation in Wales and they're trying to find out what's happening in Minnesota for their rights. But I'm sure that you could have a browser, not a browser, you could have software on your website detect that where the inquiry is coming from, and have, as annoying as it is, but important, a pop-up that comes up and says, we see that you're coming from such and such. Just know that this is Minnesota law. So not saying you can't go any further, but just make it, and you wouldn't get that annoying pop-up if you were asking from within Minnesota. So you're not burdening your Minnesota residents. I would love to do that, is to have that. And then you could adapt whatever language that is.
Has anybody here tried anything like that?
Hi, yeah, I'm Alex from Montana. We have something like that for our live chat. We use Live Chat Inc. We set up a pre-chat survey, so people have to answer questions and we check for jurisdiction. Very similar situation where we have one article that just kills it in SEO, related orders of protection, and it gets like 10 times more hits than anything else, and most of the people have a really hard time. And I think of that as like an opportunity for education. I really like how you said we care about our users, even if they're from like the Philippines. Like, I think that's a really good opportunity to give a little bit of education to those people that, hey, actually, like, you're in the wrong jurisdiction, here's where you can go. We use Law Help's map for where to find a Law Help state, but I mean, that doesn't help with the Philippines or Latin America. So I don't know, like, if we could encourage those, I mean, they have lots of other issues, but like, if we could tell them this and encourage them and give them some expertise, because what you're doing is you're creating great content, and that's why it's showing up. So, like, I just wish other people had that same access, which is really interesting to think about.
Yeah, and I would just say we have a pre-chat survey as well that asks people to even select what county in Minnesota they're in. And some people just say, like, not in Minnesota, and that's an option. And that's totally cool, but it's really funny because, yeah, they do, like, make it past that, and they're like, oh, okay, like, I don't know why you're asking me questions about Minnesota.
So asking around, they're mainly looking at traffic information, and it's because Department of Motor, or the Highway Patrol increased their patrols, and so they're just ticketing people left and right. So we had to really reach out to other agencies and figure out what in the world was happening, so.
That can trigger content. If you didn't have that content, then you, or pay attention to it, make sure it's up to date.
Yeah, I guess just like sort of then a build-on question, have people who've noticed like changes in your traffic from other locations or jurisdictions, how have you responded by content creation, or have you how have you used that to pivot in the past? I guess this is sort of going to the other, or have you been able to, I guess?
I mean, I won't say it's the only decision-making tool that we use, but I actually, sometimes also you just get a feel for what people want, and then you go to Google Analytics and you say, I thought so. I thought this is what they wanted. And, but unfortunately, it can take a very long time to produce the content that people have I mean, we have a particular topic that has been the #1 topic since 2004, and we still don't have, it's not complete. But it's helpful to have analytics, because then when you talk to people about why you're putting so many resources into something that they may not think is important, then you can say to Google, and specifically using, Massachusetts visitors. The other thing I'm not sure I said about the pop-up is that whether you can tag your content so that if it's federal, and if it's immigration, then you don't get that pop-up. That would be kind of cool. This is like, would be great if you could do that.
We like to dream.
Yeah, and one of the things that I dream about, and I don't know quite how you would do this logistically, but if, like, as a national community, we came together and, Arizona, you're like, oh, the Spanish language content on, I don't know what, is getting a lot of traffic from Minnesota, Spanish population, and Montana is like, oh, we're getting tons of hits from Minnesota on these protection orders on this resource, and we're like, oh, we're getting tons of traffic from everywhere about unmarried parents. Is like, how do we then share that around so that I'm like, hey, Montana, do you want to like adapt this unmarried parents information, and could we take a look at what you're doing for your protection order resource to see if we can adapt that for Minnesota? Or like even more pie in the sky, like we see that somebody's from Montana looking at our stuff, and we're like, hey, looks like you're from Montana. We know that Montana has this particular resource that would be really, really on point for you, and somehow like pull up that link for people to get to. And I don't know how you do that, but I could see that working if we focused on like the top 5 resources in each state that are getting hits, tons of hits from particular states or regions, is to like really come together in a curated way about how do we then get people to the right place.
Yeah.
Okay, a month from today, because we have a statewide law help. It's not pro bono, you know what I mean? It's a law help website. This is a great place to do it, but why don't we just? Because at the minimum, we could use that list and say, okay, here's our top 10 content. When are we going to meet? Who has this? And just have take an hour and a half, and everybody just have a conversation about who has what. And people who don't have analytics, that could be part of it. Is like, okay, everybody, teeny little states, look at your Google Analytics. This is where you go, just like you're doing, and saying, what's your top, and just actually start doing it there. So I think lots of times you can have the technology to do something, but you don't have the infrastructure, or you don't know who's running which website, then, because we get a lot of hits from New York and California, you guys. Partly because there's so many people there, that's probably why, but yeah, let's just do it.
That's what I was hoping somebody would say. I didn't want to force it on anyone, though.
I'll do it, and I can do it for New Hampshire and Massachusetts.
Yeah, you said you could do it for New Hampshire and Massachusetts? Yeah. Are other folks in the room on board? Would you be willing to participate? I see lots of nodding.
And you've got everybody in sketch who's here.
Yeah, and that was kind of like, our sort of dream is like to be able to collaborate on it, so.
Yeah, I just want to comment, I do really like the idea of a pop-up too, and like, that would be a really great thing to test out and get feedback from end users, because it's one of those things like people might get mad at it and not like it, but like, you're actually doing them a service.
What they'll get mad at is the fact that what they're looking for is they're frustrated.
Right, they're in a hurry, they're desperate, they want.
Yeah, but it's worse to give them content that they can.
Right. I mean, I had a live chat where I directed them to the proper website, and they came back and said, I can't find anything on that website. I was like, sorry, buddy, like, not my website.
The other, like, if you've been around long enough, I emailed Kristen Verrill in Georgia, and I said, I've got somebody from Georgia asking me a question. What have you got here? And so she sent me, she could very specifically send me straight to it, and then I emailed the person and I said, this is what they have in Georgia. So they don't have to, if you can do the deep linking instead of just sending somebody to the website, it's acknowledging that technology is not the answer to everything and that we do have to do some, and it's also that human contact people really like.
Yeah, I think one of the things we do see is that I think on chat, sometimes people are going to chat because like they have looked and we can see where they've looked and they've found the thing that I'm probably going to direct them to. But sometimes like me telling them to go back to the thing or me saying, no, that's really like the right thing for you is sort of the value add, I think.
I just had a question. Somebody mentioned about, possibly adding more like metadata so that it could, adding the state to that. I want to make sure I kind of know like where all that's supposed to be going. Like your example was was that a link to a PDF that people were going to, or was it the landing page that the PDF was on, or?
Yeah, it's a web page. We just have a PDF version as well.
Okay.
But people are getting to the page on the site. Yeah.
So do you put like meta tags for like your state in the PDF as well as on your website?
I don't think so.
Super good question.
Yeah.
I don't think
know.
our PDFs are tagged, but that's something we should look at doing. But I think our traffic is landing on the actual resource page.
We have PDFs uploaded as well as HTML content for a lot of resources, but when you do a Google search, sometimes that PDF file, the direct link is one of the top results. And so I haven't gone through all of our PDFs and done a lot of like tagging in those, but it sounds like it's maybe something I should do.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really important. I hate having PDFs on the website because I think it makes your stuff less accessible, particularly for people who are on mobile devices. But you download something from a court website or from our website, it's clearly a PDF, and the title says such and such .doc. Yeah. And people don't always read that, but I think these stupid, annoying details are really important for the people who use our stuff.
I think that those titles you get, the PDFs get indexed, through Google. So it is important what you put in the properties.
And I've heard, earlier this week, I heard that Pew is meeting with Google in the next couple of weeks to talk about how Google serves up questions about civil legal issues with a focus on jurisdiction. So I don't know how that'll impact or if that conversation will go anywhere. But in that case, I think meta tags metadata could become much more important. But so I'm going to go to our next slide. This is our last slide because it's mostly discussion. But one of the other questions is how do we address the unmet need where maybe the person who's coming to the unmarried rights and responsibilities of unmarried parents from another state, maybe there isn't an analogous resource there in that state. So how do we build that bridge and share that information and use the information that we all have about what our most popular resources are to try to help create that content in other states.
Sorry. So with Metatag, would it matter if someone doesn't include the jurisdiction in their search term? Because I think a lot of people aren't searching by jurisdiction either. And like, sorry to go back, but like, it almost seems like it's a higher level conversation that Google needs to figure out to improve their user experience. But I really like that idea of also collaboration.
Yeah, I think like there's a really good question about how do you educate the public about laws being jurisdiction specific.
Actually, just back to the question about the Google conversation, isn't part of the reason your resources has been at the top also just because Google keeps driving it to the top by the fact that people click on it, right? Isn't
Exactly.
that the way Google works?
Yeah.
So,
And I don't know if part of that is Google like using IP addresses to be like, you're in England, so I'm not going to serve up this Minnesota resource. I don't know what their solution would be and what their willingness would be and how that, I mean, that might not be the answer because if somebody's using like a VPN or something else like that, you know, they might be in Minnesota, but it looks like they're coming from out of the country.
Yeah, for a long time where I worked in Minnesota, I would show up as being in North Dakota because our IS, like internet service provider, was just based in Fargo, which is just like a border community. And so, like, if I were searching things, I looked like I was in North Dakota, but I was actually in Minneapolis. So.
I know as far as our site goes is we have a lot of users who are dealing with some kind of interstate conflict. So maybe it's a custodial dispute and the non-custodial parent has taken the child to a different state and they're trying to navigate two states' custody laws, which is very confusing. And then something that we get a lot, and this is maybe a Texas-specific thing, is people who have maybe a concealed handgun license in another state and they're moving or traveling to Texas and they want to know like how they can, if they can bring their weapon with them, things like that. Things that are a very complicated intersection between state and federal laws. So I like this idea of, you know, letting people know that things can be very specific to whatever state they are in, but people move across state lines so much that, and have, you know, lives that are kind of complicated. So part of me is a little hesitant to restrict that. Maybe restrict is not the right word. So.
Clearly and carefully. So, I think I really like this idea of the pop-up. I mean, I just thought of it. So but as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, I mean, that's certainly true in many states. All the states you border, those people, especially with custody. But maybe you could, and you'd have to sort of decide what your rules are. Like you tag the stuff with, federal. I mean, maybe partly you tag your content to trigger, maybe you'd have more than one pop-up. Not to make it too complicated, but also the language in your pop-up would be, we notice that you're out of state, or could it be so, I have no idea what would go into this, but maybe you could tell the IP address was a border state, or maybe it's a family law issue or something, but just the concept of the pop-up, yeah, it's annoying. And you're not saying you can't go any further, just be aware that you're coming from the other side. You're coming from California. We're in Massachusetts. Unless you're looking for specific Massachusetts rules, maybe you should look at California.
Something I know that I think we encounter a lot with our site, and we have to, in order to create a library account with us, I'm from a state law library, by the way. You have to, you have to determine your location, so we have a geolocation button, and I think, and there can be a lot of issues with that. We have users who are using all types of devices. Sometimes they have pop-ups blocked and they don't know how. So that's something, I know that any kind of pop-up that we have, there's just, the gamut of issues that can happen with that, potentially. So that's just something, and maybe that's something that's specific with us, but, you know.
Yeah, or I wonder too if there's other ways that to communicate. I mean, again, like we've been resistant to putting language at the top of all of our fact sheets that say, this is only for people who are in Minnesota and laws are different because of kind of that friction of more stuff we have to put up and maintain, but at the same time, that may be that might be the right answer because it would exactly just be like the same text, and it doesn't need to necessarily be in our print versions, so that it isn't burdening the people that were, like our fact sheets, again, are originated as a print resource, and a lot of our legal aid staff use those to include in mailings to their clients, although frankly it'd probably be useful information, and I guarantee you most lawyers who are communicating with their clients are not saying, by the way, did you know that Minnesota law is unique and different and special? And even though we all know that when you get a client in and they're like, well, my brother who lives in somewhere else and who has a case that's nothing like mine had this happen in his case, and so why isn't that happening in my case? So maybe we would help alleviate also some of but it must be exactly the same as this other person who has nothing in common with me. So that's another kind of potential solution that we've thought about communicating but haven't actually.
So, of course, now, 20 minutes later, what about user testing?
Yeah, and I mean, right, we can add it.
I don't think you get a state for user testing. I think user testing should be part of what you do when you come to work. I mean, I don't do it as much as I should, but I think all of us need to, why am I thinking 20 minutes later, oh yeah, why don't we try testing this on users? Because after all, they are our audience and they know what they want. You know, they know what they need. And this seems to me, pop-up, non-pop-up language on the thing is like, oh no, why not just ask the people who it matters to?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And maybe beyond just like seeing how they react to it, seeing what they take away from it.
How it works.
Yeah, so like do they notice that single sentence or do they just ignore it? And when they read it, do they say, well, whatever? What would be really cool would be to get user testers from other parts of the country.
Exactly. Which we could do if we had a collaborative.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, I think we will be sending information out to people too, because I think we would also be really interested. I guess just like, if nobody has a question at the moment, I have a question. I would just be interested for people who know like what, I mean, you said OFPs are like the top resource that you guys get the most hits on. I'd just be interested, and I can even just like hand the mic and you can pass it around, and kind of like what topics or resources are the ones that are bringing in the most traffic or kind of for your states, just because I think we have a pretty good idea, but I'd be very interested to know, so.
Types of warrants and pretrial services. That is outside of like traffic from nearby states. Those are the number two within the country.
You said types of warrants?
Yeah, the
Oh,
different
interesting.
types of warrants.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have anything on our site about that.
The article, it's all Arizona specific, but that's where we get most users from like New York or Boston, you know, to come and look at.
I mean, in all honesty, my question is, sorry. In all honesty, my question is either one, because like for us, the top content is also the thing that's pulling in, like what we're seeing, I mean, again, like ours is 11% of our total site traffic, and so that's kind of pulling in both. So I guess if you know the difference, sure, and if there is a difference, but otherwise just, you know, what things are bringing the most hits, I'm gonna.
So we're not a law help site or just a Philadelphia-specific site, but we get a lot about criminal record expungement and eviction.
And where are we?
Philadelphia.
Hi, in Washington State, we're just looking at our analytics. Our tenants' rights publication has always been #1 for years, but how to answer a lawsuit for debt collection, child protective services, and dependency actions. We get a lot of traffic from California, looking at that one as well, we noticed, but mostly family law resources like information about parenting plans.
And in our case, it may be that California just has a ton of people, but it may also be that there are a lot of Californians who move to Washington and vice versa, so that we don't have that breakdown.
Yeah, we know that the Californians are not moving to Minnesota, so.
I can only speak for the top two resources. That's Oregon Law Help, child custody, and evictions.
Hi, I'm a program in Pittsburgh, and our top one is welfare, how to apply for welfare benefits. It's almost 15% of our traffic, but a majority of the people are California. So, yeah, I mean, not a majority, but that's the top hit. PA is only second. It is weird.
That also feels like something where maybe people don't realize, because there's so much conversation about welfare at the federal level, that they don't realize that it could be also be very, very different in a state.
So I'm from Georgia, and our top resources in the past 3 or 4 years has become encounters with police. It used to be family law or eviction articles, and now it's encounters with police.
Anything you want to add? All right, I'm coming up to the front.
And do you know if those resources are accessed mostly by Georgians?
That I have not checked, but I do know they're getting it from a Google search. They're not coming through our homepage.
So the answer was that they're mostly getting it through a Google search and not from the homepage.
Something I know that we see over and over again in Texas at my library is that things that are in the news will definitely drive site traffic. So when there was the El Paso shooting, we saw a huge spike in Texas gun law searches, people who were coming from Google searching that and then wound up on our page. And that's something that we use as a decision of like whether to feature something on our homepage if we notice that there's a big a spike. Another thing is they recently raised the federal age for tobacco products, and we again had a ton of searching about that, so that was a thing that we moved to the site. Weirdly, our most popular resource is about common law marriage. So Texas has common law marriage. People ask us 10 times a day because they are not sure whether or not they are in a common law marriage. So that's a weird, maybe a weird Texas-specific thing, but.
That's fascinating. Does your library, can people send you questions or like send inquiries, and do you look at those as well, like in terms of topics?
So we get questions from a lot of different places. We have a huge number of people contact us over the phone, emails. We had a chat system that was implemented very briefly before I was there, so I know it was not very successful. I think often because people had very complicated questions, and I'm not really sure, so I don't want to speak too much about why we are not doing that program. We also would get questions in weird places. We would go to our Google, our reviews, and then find out that people had left comments with a question there. And so, I mean, they come in from all different places, so.
Yeah, we work with our library co-staffs our chat with us, and they actually are now taking, this is a tiny bit of a digression, but our law library takes the off-hours chats because they have an Ask a Librarian email. And so now when our chat is closed, basically what happens is people get a pop-up that says you can leave a message for the state law librarians. And it's interesting because actually we're getting more traffic at off hours, which is probably just because it's off hours, but we haven't, just as an interesting side note, we haven't figured out if it's because people actually feel more comfortable using like the chat without a person being on the other end of it to respond. Because we also get a lot of visitor left chats where people initiate the chat, but then they don't actually want to talk to us. And it might be because we say, we can give you legal information, but we can't give you legal advice. And they're like, I really wanted legal advice. But it is interesting because we're seeing a pretty big bump in the number of people leaving messages for our state law librarians, who fortunately are gracious and very willing to respond to all of those inquiries. And we haven't actually checked with them to see, I think most of them are Minnesota, but we haven't checked to see what the out-of-state, in-state rates are on that.
This is such a fantastic subject and, group of people, because the other thing I'm thinking is, there are ways, it used to be that you'd have organic traffic. You couldn't see what the Google terms were that people were searching to get to your website. But we don't know what people are looking for that isn't on our website, because of course they're not getting sent to our website if we don't have the content. So if we had, it doesn't necessarily mean we can, but it would bring us closer if we collaborated and we found that people were going to other state websites looking for specific information that we didn't have. And then we would know what was missing. Because that's what you don't know is, it's that same idea of people with legal needs. How do you know that people with legal needs don't know their legal needs? That's been one of these questions. I know there's an answer to that, but it's always been, how do you find what you don't know is there when you don't have a way to find it?
The known unknown.
Are you guys familiar with Google Search Console as another analytic device where you can, because that's another one where you can weed out the internationals and find out just what United States individuals are looking for, which can also be helpful, because that's one thing we had to start getting all the Latin American countries out of our queries to figure out what content we needed to boost. But if you guys aren't familiar, that's another really helpful tool.
I'm going to say one more thing. And I think the other thing is that when we first started adding languages to the website, I just assumed because custody and visitation and evictions were the top topics in English, they would be the same, because human beings have the same need everywhere, blah, blah, blah. But just listening to what everybody here is talking about, their top content in different states, we have some overlap here in terms of the family stuff and evictions, but we always have the same content, and it has been the same content for the last 15 years. So then you go to other languages, and it's just illustrating that it's not the same. Despite the fact that we're human beings, it's not the same content. And again, it's maybe they're looking there because we don't have content on driving licenses and warrants and guns and things like that.
Yeah, it kind of feels like this kind of conversation should be informing our decisions about what content to create. When we're doing like a legal needs assessment in our community, like that's one way to get at that information, but also looking at like talking to you all and saying, oh, there's a real need for information on encounters with police because that happens in Minnesota too and is a big issue. Or there are issues on types of warrants. We don't have anything about that, but maybe if we did, that would be really helpful. Yeah.
About that, but if we did, would that be our highest? Same with your welfare. I never considered, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, just on the topics, I'm thinking I would potentially just like send one of you an email and be like, hey, can you tell me like what visitors from Minnesota to your site are hitting? Or like if you wanted to email us and be like, can you just pull for me like Pennsylvania, like based, like what are Pennsylvania people coming to Law Help MN and looking at like that even just those snapshots between might be really interesting.
Yeah, that's something too, kind of like I mentioned, we noticed that what's been most helpful is what people are searching in our site directly rather than what they are Googling typically, because 9 times out of 10 people get to our site from Google by just Texas laws or some variation on that. But the site searches that they do are a lot more interesting, and they help us kind of track if we get the same question over and over again, or people are searching. A lot of times I can see when someone has searched something in our site and hasn't found anything, and then they show up in our reference database later because they call us since they can't find something. But I know step-parent adoptions, that was a question that we got over and over again.
So I do think that, like, on the collaboration tip, like, I was like, oh, well, I can't really, we're not the same kind of website. But, like, I think that actual, like, what are people coming in for at agencies that serve clients could be really useful information for law help resources.
Yeah, and I should add that we are under, our parent organization is Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, which is the one of the two really big legal aid offices. And so the people who draft and review all of our content are the legal aid lawyers. And although it involves a lot of pulling teeth, our content manager talks to them every year when we review to kind of say, like, where do you guys see a need? And also, like, which of these fact sheets should we kill? Like, we had one, like, how to get an interpreter, that, like, we saw that the traffic on it was really bad, and we were also like, is this still we've had this thing for 20 years, like, do people still need this? Are you handing this out to clients? Are clients asking you? And they're like, no. Great, bye. Like, that one's done. And so, yeah, I think, like, a combination, but yeah, it's like it's sort of like, yeah, what are people looking for that they aren't finding?
And I think, like, adding on to that conversation would be how are people talking about it?
Yeah.
And, like, being really intentional about, like, when they're coming into your office, like, what are their words that they're using? Because that's probably what they're going to put into Google, which is maybe different from how we would initially think to write about it on the site.
So you were talking about site search, and a lot of people come to all of us, I think, from Google, but 4% of our users, once they're there, use site search. And I was at another presentation a couple of years ago with Law Help website, not pro bono net Law Help, but Law Help websites. And it seemed across the board that once somebody's on your site, they don't want to use, there's a significant number do use site search, but it's a very small percentage. And I don't know if that's still true for people.
I can tell you for the last 30 days, we had 0
Wow.
site searches.
So that's Pittsburgh, last 30 days, 0 site searches. All right. Yeah.
And again, kind of like I mentioned before, that they are more detailed and nuanced, I guess, if you will, rather than what people are searching on Google or how do they get to us.
And we found in user testing that, we don't get a huge number of people using search, but in our user testing, we found there were some people who, like, refused to navigate the site in any other way, even when we were like, we're testing this particular part of the site. If you were to start here, what would you do? And they would be like, no, I would just search. And we're just like, wouldn't do it. So yeah, it'll be interesting, I think, especially to see how that evolves over the years, because I think that's becoming more and more common. And I think it also depends on where your site search is and how prominent that is.
I've moved my site search 3 places, redesigned it twice, and I'm still getting the same numbers.
So that comment was that you've moved the site search 3 times and there's been no impact on the use of it.
Yeah. And I'll be sitting right next, and I don't know if it's an age thing, I'll be sitting right next to a lawyer, and she's like, I can't find anything on your website. I said, did you try search?
Yeah.
And we've had the exact opposite. So saying that, like, a lawyer won't use the search, we have at least one of our legal aid attorneys in a program who we put a resource up, and she's like, I can't find it using site search. We were like, did you just look for, like, under this topic? She's like, no, I just want to type in, or no, actually she was trying to Google.
She was using Google.
She was just using Google.
But didn't know that Google wasn't Law Help. Anyway, it's another story.
We have some internal promotion issues. Anyway, we have just a couple minutes left. So.
These are 2 more dogs from our office. But I think, yeah, we have just about 5 more minutes. We wanted to make sure that you all have our contact information, and we'd love to reach out, kind of like Carolyn was saying, and create a community and have a call to see if we can kind of move this conversation forward into actually implementing some things. So it would be super helpful if you all would like mark on Sketch that you are here, and then we'll reach out to you. If you're not comfortable with us reaching out to you, please pretend that you weren't here on Sketch, and we will not bother you.
Or just politely respond to our email with like, thanks, but no thanks.
How about, I'm going to try to just put a spreadsheet on Google Drive right now. If you could put their state in the top 10 content on there.
Sure.
That works. And
Yeah,
that
so
comment- go.
we'll create Carolyn's going to create a spreadsheet on Google Sheets where people could put their state and some of their top 10 content pieces. Because, yeah, that would be super interesting, and I think we'd love to know what other people are getting traffic on, just like because we'd love to, we can go to your sites and look at this, but that's a fairly large undertaking. It'd be nice to have the scope narrowed a little bit, I think.
Yeah, and I think something else that I'll commit to doing is I think it would be really helpful to, I'll do like a breakdown of state population, because I think, we're all going to probably have New York, Illinois, California as top states, but for Minnesota as a smaller state with a population probably smaller than some metro areas in the United States, it would be helpful for me to know like 10% of your users are from Minnesota for a particular resource, because that would really speak to the fact that that's something that Minnesotans are looking for, but they can't find.